We are going to look at, not at the book of Acts today. We're going to be looking at the book of Matthew. If you would, please turn to the 21st chapter of Matthew. The triumphal entry, which we will read about this morning, is extraordinarily significant, and I hope to widen all of our view of the importance, the significance of what we are going to read about, and why this would have been so significant, not just as a sort of happy little spontaneous parade that broke out, but because of all the prophecies and the things that had been foretold to the Jews, the Israelites, that they would have been recognizing as fulfilling of prophecy during this time, during this day. This account is recorded in all of the four Gospels in its own way, sharing slightly different details in each account, but by and large, repeating to us the same story. 4 times, 4 Gospels, all writing down this incredible moment. Only 2 of the Gospels contain Jesus' birth or anything about his younger years. 4 of the Gospels write down what happened on this day, just about a week prior to Jesus' crucifixion, at the time of the Passover in Jerusalem. So would you stand with me? We're going to read the first 11 verses, of chapter 21. It says, when they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethpage, a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem, at the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, and immediately he will send them. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt and laid their coats on them. And he sat on the coats. Most of the crowd spread their coats in the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them in the road. The crowds going ahead of him and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. When he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, who is this? And the crowds were saying, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. The word of the Lord. Amen. Would you lift your hands and we'll pray to the Lord together. Lord, thank you for your majesty, your power, your glory. Help us to see it with eyes that are clear, alert, open. Father, I pray that you would expand the sense of your glory in all of our minds, that we would live in obedience to a God that is glorious and obvious to us. In Jesus' name, amen. You can be seated. Many of us have heard the phrase before, the calm before the storm. We've had a lot of storms here recently. A lot of areas around Toledo have been without power. Especially, actually, we were driving back from Michigan about a week ago. We stopped in Gaylord, and that whole town had been without power for like 72 hours straight. But we've experienced some storms here over the last handful of weeks, a lot of rain. You've heard the expression before, the calm before the storm. That moment when everything is a little bit subdued and the clouds are dark, but there's no rain yet. All the animals, right? Animals kind of a theme this morning, animals. Sense what's about ready to happen, and so they've hushed themselves. The calm before the storm. While the triumphal entry into Jerusalem was a moment certainly of peace, came right before Jesus' betrayal, Judas, and his crucifixion at the hands of the Jews. I don't think any of us would be wise to describe this particular moment, for as peaceful as it was and as happy as it was, as calm. It was not calm. There was no calm before the storm. This is a pivotal moment in Jesus' life that we've just read about. It's a pivotal moment in the fulfillment of the Scriptures. It's a monumental moment for all the Jews that would have been coming back in droves. You've got to imagine the Passover and what that meant for the Jews and what it required of them. So imagine large groups traveling together in bands on the roads that led back from the area surrounding Jerusalem to observe this Passover feast, to remember the salvation that God had granted them under the hand of Moses many, many hundreds of years before this took place. It's a monumental moment. But as we'll see, this moment was of importance for a different reason than many of those Jews coming to Jerusalem might have thought. He was different than they anticipated. And this morning, I hope to think with you a little bit about how it was different, how their anticipation of what was to come was different than what God had foreordained, how it was different than God's perfect plan, and in some ways the dissonance between what they anticipated and what God had prepared. Having read the passage just a moment ago, I'd like to draw out a little bit of the surrounding context a little more for us together. There was an expectation in the minds of the Jewish people that the Messiah was due, was generally about ready to come. They expected him to be a prince. It had been foretold. All of these prophecies were known. Think about Jesus and his speaking in the Gospels. Do you not know? Do you not know? Do you not know what the Scripture says? Always speaking to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, and by extension to the general populace of the Jews. Do you not know? Do you not remember? There was an expectation in the minds of the Jewish people that the Messiah was about to come. They expected him to be a prince, and more than a prince, a king, who would make, they thought, war against those that they were ruled by, restoring to them their lost Jewish nationality, their lost independence. There were many who, though they did not believe in Jesus to be with any sort of spiritual faith, nevertheless hoped that he would be a great help to their earthly woes and that he would deliver them from their political rulers. In the Gospels, there's a handful of occasions where we are told that the crowds in Jerusalem and in other cities sought to take Jesus by force and make them their king. This has happened a couple of times over the last couple of years. And at each one of those times, what does it say Jesus did? Do you recall? What did he do? He hid themselves from them. He evaded their grasp. He hid themselves so that they were not able to carry out their will of going to him and elevating him to their king. There was a common desire that someone should lift the yoke of their oppressors off of their shoulders, so that when the Jews experienced Christ's mighty miracles and sat under his authoritative, powerful teaching, that desire for that yoke to be lifted gave birth to thought, and they imagined more and more that Jesus might be the one to restore the kingdom of Israel to the former glory. Jesus wasn't blind to this reality. Jesus wasn't blind to what they anticipated from him. He sensed this as well. He knew that pressures were mounting. On one side was the will of the people. On the other side, his Father's will. and it was coming to a crisis. He must either go to his death for disappointing the popular expectations of the masses and what they wanted from him, or he must bend to their wishes and be made king. And we know which he chose. He came to seek and save that which was lost, not being made a king himself in the sense that the Jews were anticipating and hoping for. Based on what we're told in the Gospel of John, just about 1 week prior to this moment when Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and we know it as the triumphal entry, a week prior to this, Jesus had worked one of his most miraculous, impressive, and famous miracles yet. What did he do? A week prior to this, or thereabouts, 7 to 10 days, he had raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus had died. He had been dressed, laid in the tomb, and he'd been laying there for 4 days. 4 days of death. He wasn't just dead, he was dead. He's getting to the point of smelling. And God's power through Christ raised Lazarus from the dead. He traveled there. He lifted up his voice. He called to him from the mouth of the tomb where he was laid. Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus came out. This miracle was so amazing, so astounding, that we are told that it was the talk of the town. And not only was it the talk of the town in Bethany, we are told that many from the surrounding areas from Jerusalem made the 2-mile trek out to Bethany to witness, to see this amazing miracle that had happened. No one had ever heard of anything like a man who had been dead for 4 days in a tomb, wrapped up and bandaged, resurrected, not resurrected, but given new life. Many, we're told, came to observe what had happened in Bethany. What we need to recognize from this is that the raising of Lazarus, it wasn't done in a vacuum. It wasn't done in some unseen, isolated place, but it was something that multitudes, many people, heard about first and then went and witnessed. This man who was dead, now alive. They could testify to that fact. The raising of Lazarus served as a catalyst that propelled all the people in their thoughts about Christ and in their conviction about what he might be able to do, in their presuppositions about what his purposes might be and what is on the cusp of their lives as he goes up to Jerusalem. It propels their worship and their praise of Christ as he goes up for the Passover. Again, this moment in time where everything, the stars seem to be aligning. It's the time of the Passover when we were freed from our burdens and the yoke of Egypt was lifted off of our shoulders and we had deliverance in the Lord. Could it be? The Israelites' anticipation is growing as they witness these signs of Jesus' power. Pressure is mounting to make Jesus their king. And I think we can kind of understand this, at least in a very, very small way. Over the last few years, you have seen and you've heard the excitements of conservatives over getting a leader that they value and rightly or wrongly think is going to bring them some sort of good. And this is such a smaller version of what would have been happening in Jerusalem, obviously. But you see the giddiness and you see people talking about it, and the amount of time that's spent talking about how excited they are, right? And it pales in comparison to this. There's no prophecy about our political leaders. Sorry, some of you, huh? We got people in isolation listening to podcasts going, yeah. This was thousands of people traveling together. Prophecies were being fulfilled. Miracles were happening. Not just election results going your way. Miracle. A man raised from the dead. No doubt there were some in that crowd that day as Jesus walked into Jerusalem who waved palm branches and raised their voices and shouted and smiled because they saw Jesus with eyes of faith. They saw Jesus rightly. They saw him as he truly was, the Lamb of God who came away to take away the sins of the world. But for all their joy, for all their frenzy, the masses, by and large, only saw Jesus as a means to an end of their own desires. What they thought should happen, what they wanted to happen. A Messiah that would right the wrongs that were done against them, rather than one who would place their sins, deal with theirs. I don't want a Messiah dealing with my sins. I want him dealing with everybody else's sins. They wanted a Messiah who was going to deal with all the issues outside of themselves, all the people they didn't like, instead of the Messiah coming to deal with them, their sins, the things that caused others around them to grieve, to be sad, to be hurt. They didn't want that Messiah. And this is made evident in the fact, as we already heard earlier in the service, that those who on this day are filled with joy, shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, just a few days later are going to be also crying out, crucify him, crucify him. And the cries of his death are going to be more loud and vehement than the cries of Hosanna. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. The ball is rolling. The anticipation of the Jews is growing. Excitement is spilling over. Pressure is building, and Jesus knows that it's time to finish his work. His time has come. So he went up to Jerusalem with the intent of declaring his kingship publicly. And if you haven't thought about this before, this is what is happening. Jesus, in this passage, this is not Jesus in a passive role, just sort of finding a donkey to ride on and the people doing what they're doing. His feet were tired. Do you think Jesus needed a donkey? Huh? Do you think his feet got tired about 1,000 feet? I've never been there, but a short distance outside of Jerusalem that he said, find me a mini donkey. I'm just too tired. I can't. No, it's ridiculous. Jesus is making a very public declaration in this passage, though he may not speak it with his voice, about his kingship. The triumphal entry marks actually a very dramatic shift in the life in Jesus' approach. Certainly, Jesus was no stranger to Jerusalem. He was no stranger to the temple. He was no stranger to crowds. He often, though, avoided public displays. And of course, there are many things he did that were very public, but especially when he was in the cities, if you think about it, and if you read the Gospels, this is an interesting fact. When he healed in cities, he often instructed those that he healed in one way or another to keep quiet about the work that he had done. If you were to read the first chapter of Mark, in the first chapter of Mark, Jesus heals a leper. And Jesus very specifically tells that leper to say nothing to anyone about him, but he said, go and get cleansed by the priest. So Jesus heals this leper. He says, don't say anything to anyone. Go and get cleansed by the priest. So, going beyond just saying, don't say anything about what I've done, but he actually says, go to the temple, go through this ritual that had been commanded in the Old Testament, almost to implicate that something else had cleansed him. It's a striking thing. But sadly, that man didn't listen. He was healed by Christ, but he didn't listen to Christ. He went around proclaiming all that Christ had done, and the passage goes on to say that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but he was in desolate places. Most of Jesus' teaching and his healing and his ministry were not in the cities, especially the cities where the who's who's resided, where the religious elites resided. He spent much of his time in rural regions and fishing towns throughout Galilee. He taught in fields, he taught on hillsides. The feedings of the 5,000, the feedings of the 4,000, right? The Sermon on the Mount. He taught from boats. He taught from synagogues in smaller towns. So much of the time, He wasn't in the big cities. And when he was, he often wanted those around him to remain quiet. Withdrawing from the crowd was a common practice. We see that phrase often in the Gospels. After being with the crowd, he would withdraw from it. So much of the time, he was not in big cities. But now, his time having come, there's a shift. He puts it into a different gear. He rides into Jerusalem in broad daylight to shouts of Hosanna. He had told the demons to be quiet and not to say who he was. Now, he's in a different gear. People, thousands probably, around him, shouting, singing, dancing, Hosanna, riding on a donkey, a clear fulfillment of the messianic prophecy in Zechariah 9:9. It's absolutely clear. On purpose. He did this intentionally. He was teaching, maybe not with his mouth, but with his life and actions. It was undeniable. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus had repeatedly said, "My time has not yet come." But now, at this moment, Jesus shifts. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Before this, as I said, when the people sought to make Jesus king, he withdrew. But now the Pharisees see the crowds shouting, Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna in the highest. And what do they say? They approach Jesus and they say, rebuke your disciples. Why are you allowing them to say this about you? And you remember what Jesus says to them? If they're silent, the stones will cry out. This is a shift in tone. This is a shift in approach. This is a shift in what Jesus says. Of course, he's made a ministry of rebuking the Pharisees. This is not the first rebuke they receive. But this is definitely a shift in his posture and in what's going on. This is a pivotal moment in the ministry of Christ, and we observe this change. His entry was a visible proclamation of his kingdom and his kingship. I want to read to us from Zechariah. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. This is what's quoted in the Gospels. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It was necessary. It was necessary for Jesus to make a very public, bold, clear declaration that he, in fact, was the Son of David, the rightful heir to David's throne. And he did so on this occasion. It was necessary that he should leave his enemies no excuse in order that they might not say, if you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. He did tell them plainly. On this day, riding into Jerusalem on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He made this claim unmistakably clear. Riding through the streets of Jerusalem, this was his clear proclamation. It was a clear manifesto of his royal right to the throne of David. Nothing could have been more clearly proclaimed. No proclamation could have been issued with more vibrance, loudness. Jesus was sounding a clear note. Make no mistake about it. At this point, I want to focus on one particular aspect, having sort of given us this context and seeking to take us there to what's going on and the fulfillment of this prophecy. I want to focus, there's so many things we could focus on. I want to focus on one thing, and that is that he rode in on this donkey. He was not a king of horses, at least not now. He was a king of donkeys. King of donkeys. Jesus was traveling with his disciples toward Jerusalem. They stopped at this village of Bethpage outside. And as we read, he sent two of his disciples. He said, in the city opposite us, there's going to be there's a donkey and a colt. Go and take them and bring them back so that we might ride up to the city. Well-known fulfillment of the prophecy in Zechariah. But there's another layer of significance that we may have overlooked before. When God delivered Israel out of slavery in Egypt, which was what the Passover was celebrating, He gave them riches. He gave them possessions. He gave them a law. He gave them land. He took them from being a family to being a nation, people, a law, territory. But while God provided all of those things, there was something that he did not provide them that we would think of when we think about a nationhood. What was that? It was a king, a ruler. People, territory, law, but no king. Of course, he did this purposely. Why? Because he was their king. Israel wasn't content with that, though. They looked around at the nations that surrounded them and said, we want to be like them. We don't want to serve a king we can't see. And so during the time of the judges, you may recall that one of the favorite judges, Gideon, had immense military success, victory. And after those victories, the people of Israel went to him and tried to make him their king. He resisted. He said no. And so a little while later, the elders of Israel again went to Samuel, who was the last of the judges, and said, "Give us a king. We've been following God. He's given us Moses and Aaron and the judges and you, Joshua, and you, but we want a king. We want a king. We aren't content to have a territory and a law and a people and have to look to God to be our king." Samuel was angry at their request. But interestingly, God said to him, "Listen to them and do as they've asked. They have not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me." This is where it again gets interesting. Strikingly, when Samuel went to anoint Israel's first king, the young man that he was sent to was on a mission. You remember what he was doing? He was looking for his father's donkeys. Both Israel's first king and Jesus assumed the throne shortly after a search for donkeys. I don't think that's coincidence. It's fitting, too, because God had warned Israel not to appoint kings who would acquire horses for themselves. And we probably have some equestrian lovers out here. What's up with that? Why did God say, don't appoint kings who like horses? Is it about the horses? Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't about the animals. It was about the trust. It was about where that king and therefore that nation would put their trust. Horses and chariots were what the kings of the world put their trust in. Israel was not supposed to put their trust in military might. They were to trust in the Lord, their God. Of course, it didn't take long for the Israelites to ignore God's command on that too, just like demanding a king. Soon enough, they had stockpiled horses, they had stockpiled chariots, just like the nations that were around them. So here again, a striking contrast as we think about the beginning of Israel's first king and what's happening on this day in fulfillment of Zechariah 9. A striking contrast. Saul, the king that the people demanded, began his kingship chasing lost donkeys for his father. And he soon gave them up, and we know that he did use donkeys from time to time, but he also raided the Philistines and took their donkeys, or their horses rather, and didn't destroy all of them as he was commanded by God. He began his kingship chasing lost donkeys. Jesus, the king that all the Jews were hoping for, sent his disciples to find donkeys, not to chase something lost, though. No. He was making a deliberate statement about what kind of king he would be, what kind of king he was. Not a king of war horses, a donkey king. Christ knew what the people were expecting. He knew that they were looking for a king who would give them what they wanted, who would bring liberation, who would lift the yoke of their burdens, who would restore the former glory of Israel. With that being the expectation of the city, every choice he made about his entrance into Jerusalem should be important to us. He told his disciples, you're going to find a donkey tied up with the colt beside her. He explained that if anyone questioned them about what they were doing, they should simply say, the Lord has need of them, and the people would let them go without any issue. It's easy to picture this. I've always thought about this passage before I was really thinking about it more intentionally. I've always thought about this passage that this is some sort of like Jedi mind trick. These are not the droids you're looking for, Like, the Lord has need of them, Oh, take them. That's always the way I've interpreted this in my mind. Like some sort of spiritual, not hocus pocus, but some sort of spiritual, that kind of thing. Remember the rising tension I've already been speaking about. The crowds making their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. Many witnesses in those crowds, mixed all around, who had either heard about this raising of Lazarus, who had gone and seen with their own eyes that this man who had died was now alive. All of this is spreading like wildfire at this time. This frenzy doesn't break out from nowhere. It's been building, guys. It's been building. Jesus wasn't relying on a trick when he said, tell them the Lord has need of it. He knew that the owners would gladly release the donkey once they understood its purpose, who it was for. By riding into Jerusalem, Jesus was making a clear and a deliberate claim to kingship. In just a few days, Pilate would affirm it. A sign above Jesus' head on the cross, the King of the Jews. The King of the Jews. There's no mistaking it. The momentum building in Jesus' ministry. And with his intentional fulfillment of Zechariah 9, the crowds are journeying to Jerusalem for the Passover, and they are in some ways just bracing for this, what they hope is going to be some sort of revolution. They expect it at any moment. Jesus is going to cast off his cloak and reveal his crown and his scepter and his sword, and he's going to wage vengeance on them. He's going to rally the people with one voice at this pivotal moment of the Passover when thousands and thousands are in Jerusalem and there is some hope for some sort of organized revolt against their oppressors, and they're going to overthrow their rulers, reclaiming what the prophets had promised. Everything that they believed was rightfully theirs. This is the focal point where the Jews' expectation of a king and Jesus' declaration of his kingship begin to touch. This is the point. Jesus was making a point by riding into town on a young donkey. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy, not just the fulfillment of a prophecy. It wasn't just to fulfill a prophecy, rather. It was to speak and testify to his kingship. The King of Zion will do this. A future king will ride into Jerusalem in this way. He would not come on a war horse borrowed from the Romans. He would not come on a horse bought with his own money. He would not come on a borrowed horse. He would come on a humble, the text says, beast of burden, not fit to carry a king, fit to pull a plow, a beast of burden. And if that were not humble enough, it was a small one. When I was in high school, I used to drive from my parents' house down to Toledo Christian, where I went to school, on a 49cc Honda scooter. And I did that for many years with I was about this size back then. I'll let your imagination run wild. So with me and my backpack, and when I played football, with my bag of football pads strapped to my back or in between my knees, on that little scooter, I could manage to get about 33 miles an hour. And over the years, I loved riding on that thing. And over the years of riding, I picked up on some some of the tricks of the trade, if you will, for those of us that are bicyclists, or what do you call them? Bikers, yeah. And I noticed over the years that when I'd pass dudes on their Harleys or on their Goldwings, they'd pass each other suddenly and go, just like this, and then go back to the throttle, or what, well, I had a throttle, they had gears. You know, just this little flick of the finger, just like that. I took it to heart. I decided I'm going to be part of the club. So whenever I'd see a group of guys, you know, on a sunny afternoon, 30 bikes going down River Road, you know, probably out to Defiance or somewhere, I'd just go right like that. Riding my 49cc scooter, full helmet, not just visor, face mask, huge, on a glorified weed whacker engine of a scooter. I let them know who I was. Good to see you. Good to see you. I had a lot of fun. Here I was, a full-grown man, with a helmet that really did fit more of a crotch rocket. It was a crotch rocket style helmet on this little bike. You think about how funny it might have looked. Listen, this is Jesus, but infinitely more so. No one wanted to make anything out of me riding that scooter to school, other than maybe mockery of the kids at the school themselves. But no one was wanting to do anything great with me. No one was following me. I was just a kid riding to school on my scooter. I was no king. I certainly wasn't claiming to be. Jesus was the great king, riding his 49cc scooter. Instead of coming to Jerusalem mounted with an impressive muscular steed, without pomp and grandeur, with battalions, swords, shields, he didn't come with any of that. Claiming to be king, claiming, remember, to be the one fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah and other prophecies. He came on a donkey, and not even a full-size one, a small, young donkey. Jesus, humble and mounted on a donkey. And I want to ask us as we close here, are you willing to have this Lord, this King, reign over you? Are you willing to embrace Jesus as he is, as such, mounted on a small donkey? Are you willing to follow after this king? Are you willing to take off your coat and lay it in the dirt to make a pathway for his feet? You remember, cloaks, tunics, coats, they're very costly possessions. We didn't have Amazon with cheap clothes or whatever website you... Some of people's most treasured possessions was worn on them. And they strip themselves of their outer garments, and they throw them in the dirt to be trampled by the hooves of a donkey to honor Christ. Are you willing to lay down your coat at the feet of Christ? What is the coat? Are you willing to lay your own desires before him, your own aspirations, your own comforts, so that he can trot on them, he can walk on them for his glory because you love him? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to follow him in his humility? Jesus, the Messiah, the rightful heir of the throne of David, did not enter Jerusalem on a great white horse. Nothing about his journey to the temple had any semblance of military might or political power. It was a happy display. It was an energetic display, but it was eminently humble. It was the sort of thing that children participated in. And just like now, here, you imagine the world looking on with all of us, with our children, raising branches in the air and singing. It's humble. This is what was going on. Though he could have ridden the wind, he could have ridden a peal of lightning, he could have been pulled by chariots of fire with teams of horses. He chose to borrow a donkey and to ride on her colt. What humility. So, are you willing to follow after this Lord? Are you willing to follow him in his poverty? You remember that Jesus frequently had no place to lay his head. No house, no horse, not even a donkey. He had to borrow one. He exhibited dependence on others' goodwill toward him. He was not ashamed of the fact that his kingdom was not of this world, that his crown was not composed of gold or rubies. He was rich, but for our sakes he became poor. Are you willing to follow him? And that question really doesn't go far enough, because what we really need to ask ourselves is, are you willing to follow him for who he is rather than for who you want him to be or hope he will be or anticipate him being? Because many were willing to follow him on that day. But no one was willing, or few were willing to follow him for the king that he was. They wanted to follow a king after their own imaginations, after their own desires, after their own creation, who would do for them what they wanted, who would not call them to do what he wanted. Are you willing to follow after him for who he is? Many Jews rejoiced and followed Jesus as he rode up to Jerusalem because they saw the potential for kingship, the potential for their liberation. They remembered the prophecy from 500 years ago in Zechariah, which had foretold that the king of Zion would appear riding upon a donkey. And they saw this miracle worker, this man who raised Lazarus from the dead, riding up to Jerusalem on a donkey. And they saw potential for him to be their king, for him to usher in the second reign of David. But they were greatly mistaken. And I hope that you will not make the same mistake. He didn't have potential to be their king. He was their king. He was their king. For all the fanfare and the excitement of this particular day, it didn't last because the masses were not willing to follow Jesus for the king that he was. When they realized the nature of his kingship, when they realized his humility, when they realized that he wasn't just fulfilling a prophecy by sitting on the donkey, but he was going to the temple and not to the palace. When they realized that he was not interested in freeing them from their rulers, but he only had a desire to free them from the rule and the reign of sin on their own hearts, they didn't rejoice any longer. They weren't found walking with him. Not even his disciples stayed walking with him until the very end. Instead, as we already said, their shouts of Hosanna turned to shouts of blood. They didn't want a donkey king. They wanted a king of a chariot. So I ask you again, what sort of king do you want? What sort of king are you willing to rejoice in? Are you willing to trust? It's interesting, Zechariah, rejoice greatly, shout aloud. Are you willing to trust that Jesus can make you happy on his terms rather than your own? Are you willing to follow him in his humility, knowing that doing so will bring you joy and it will bring you freedom? Even if he rides on a donkey and you're required to throw down your prized possessions, your coat, your desires, your aspirations, the sins that you love at his feet for him to trot on. Are you willing to follow him in trust, by faith, for his glory when your pride wants you to go in the opposite direction, or when your lusts are pulling at you, or when your emotions are raging and telling you to turn, or when the crowd has turned away and you feel lonely? Are you willing to follow Jesus on his colt? Are you willing to trust the words spoken by God through Zechariah, his prophet? To the citizens of Zion, say, rejoice greatly, shout in triumph. This is a command. Behold, your king is coming to you. Not a man you might be able to make king. Your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with able to save, endowed with salvation. Humble, mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of the donkey. And so I ask, are you willing to follow this king, to have this king? Another way of asking that same question is to ask, are you a citizen of Zion? Shout aloud, O citizen of Zion. Are you a citizen of Zion? Will you rejoice in this sort of king? Will you ride with him in his humility? Do you recognize that he is, in fact, the king that you need, even if he wasn't the king that you anticipated? Are you willing to walk alongside him, to worship him, to throw yourself down at his feet for who he is rather than for who you want him to be? If you aren't, the fanfare won't last. You might be here today, but you won't be here at a later point. The excitement will slip away from you, and you will find something else to fill the void that you have in your heart. You must be willing to worship him for who he is. But if you are willing to worship him for who he is, I want to end by reminding you that you should be encouraged, that you should shout for joy, that you should sing, O inhabitant of Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. Shout for joy, O inhabitant of Zion. Great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. You can be sure of this: those who ride with Christ in his humility will be those who also ride with him in his glory and in his exaltation on the final day when he returns once again, no longer entering Jerusalem on a small, undersized donkey, but on a great white horse. Would you pray with me?